It arrived not with a slow creep, but like a sudden, violent thunderclap that utterly shattered the quiet normalcy of medieval life almost instantly. Honestly, no one, from the highest king on his throne to the lowliest peasant in the field, had the mental framework to comprehend an invisible killer that moved like the wind. The speed of the contagion was terrifying, outpacing official decrees, royal messengers, and even the fastest prayers mumbled by terrified priests in stone churches. You have to imagine that within days, thriving, noisy communities were reduced to ghostly silence, broken only by the chilling sound of the death carts rattling over the stones. The established authorities, the local lords and city councils, found their usual bureaucratic responses were laughably ineffective against a biological tidal wave of this magnitude. It was a moment where the rigid hierarchy of the feudal world just froze in its tracks, paralyzed by an enemy it couldn't see, bribe, or fight with swords. People looked to their leaders for a plan, for reassurance, for anything, but found only the same paralyzed terror reflected back in their eyes. The infrastructure of daily existence, from bustling markets to crowded courtrooms, simply dissolved into chaos faster than anyone could comprehend the scale of the disaster. It felt, perhaps, like humanity had suddenly lost its steering wheel, hurtling uncontrollably toward a cliff edge with no one in charge of the brakes. And when the people realized those in charge were just as helpless as they were, did the real panic begin. It is fascinating in a grim way to realize that the Great Silk Road, once the celebrated artery of wealth and culture, became a superhighway for demise. The very ships that brought spices, silks, and stories from distant lands were now unknowingly carrying the seeds of continental destruction in their rat-infested holds. Globalization isn't new. This was its dark mirror image, proving that humanity was connected not just by greed, but by a shared vulnerability to biology. A merchant in Genoa could fall ill on a Tuesday, and by the next month, the infection he carried would be devastating a family in faraway London. The plague didn't respect borders, city walls, languages, or religions. It was the ultimate, horrifying equalizer that treated every human body exactly the same. For the first time in recorded history, humanity was facing a truly synchronized catastrophe, a shared nightmare that stretched from the steppes of Asia to the coasts of Ireland. Think about the psychological impact of realizing there was nowhere safe to run, because the very act of travel was what spread the danger further. Port cities, usually vibrant hubs of energy and opportunity, turned into silent quarantine zones where incoming ships were viewed as floating coffins. The intricate web of medieval trade, which had taken centuries to build, unraveled in a matter of years, replaced by isolation and suspicion. When the world suddenly shrinks down to the four walls of your own home because the outside is toxic, what happens to the human mind? This was the pivotal moment when the three great pillars of medieval stability, medicine, monarchy, and the church, simultaneously crumbled under the weight of reality. Doctors, bless their hearts, were relying on ancient texts by Galen that were utterly useless against Yersinia pestis, offering bizarre remedies that sometimes hastened death. Kings, who claimed a divine right to rule and protect their subjects, found their armies and gold reserves powerless against an enemy they couldn't see. To be fair, the most devastating blow was spiritual. People flocked to churches for salvation, only to find that the priests were dying just as fast as the sinners. If God's chosen representatives on earth were not spared, the average person began to wonder if the heavens had simply gone silent or, worse, empty. The disillusionment was profound. The experts of the day were exposed as frauds, peddling hope when they had absolutely no real answers to give. You saw incredible acts of desperation as people turned away from established medicine to mystics, flagellants, and anyone promising a miracle cure. The psychological safety net that had held medieval society together for centuries was ripped apart, leaving people free-falling into an intellectual void. It was a brutal lesson in humility for humanity, proving that our grandest structures and deepest beliefs could be undone by microscopic indifference. When the people you are supposed to trust the most look you in the eye and have nothing to say, where does that misplaced faith go? Fear ceased to be just an emotion and became the dominant governing force of daily life, dictating every single interaction between human beings. The natural human impulse towards community and connection was replaced by a primal, deeply ingrained instinct for self-preservation at any cost. You know, stories from the time tell of parents abandoning sick children and husbands leaving wives, as the terror of contagion overrode the deepest bonds of love. The very air felt thick with suspicion. A cough in a crowded market was no longer just a cough, but a potential death sentence for everyone nearby. People began to barricade themselves in their homes, creating miniature fortresses, hoping that wood and stone could keep out an airborne apocalypse. The psychology of the era shifted dramatically toward short-term survival. Why plan for a future 5 years from now when you might not see next week? It was a world where silence became terrifying because it meant life was vanishing, but noise was also terrifying because it might mean a mob was approaching. Trust evaporated, and when trust is gone, the social contract that allows a complex society to function dissolves right along with it. Honestly, it's hard for us to imagine living with that level of sustained adrenaline, where every shadow could hide the end of your world. When fear is the only thing you feel from the moment you wake up, how long before you lose your humanity completely? And then, as it always does in times of unbearable pressure, the darkest aspect of human psychology emerged: the desperate need to find someone to blame. Unable to accept that nature was randomly cruel, people invented comforting lies, convincing themselves the plague was a deliberate act of malice by human agents. Tragically, minority communities, especially Jewish populations in Europe, became the convenient targets for this poisonous explosion of collective rage and fear. Horrific rumors spread that these innocent communities were poisoning wells, a ludicrous claim that nonetheless led to massacres and burnings across the continent. You have to understand, this wasn't just organized hate, it was a hysterical, grassroots panic where neighbors suddenly turned murderous against people they had known for years. It is a profound and sad truth that when human beings are terrified of dying, they often become incredibly efficient at killing others. These acts of violence were a desperate attempt to regain control, a magical thinking that believed purging the outsider would appease God and stop the plague. The authorities, often helpless to stop the mobs or sometimes even encouraging them, watched as the rule of law was replaced by the rule of the torch. This chapter of history stands as a permanent, shameful monument to how quickly civilization can veneer crack under the pressure of existential terror. If we faced a similar unexplainable threat today, are we so sure we wouldn't find new scapegoats to burn upon the altar of our fear? Paradoxically, The massive loss of life acted as the greatest disruptor of the rigid economic system, known as feudalism, that Europe had ever seen. For centuries, the equation was simple and cruel. Land was scarce and valuable, while peasant labor was abundant, cheap, and easily replaceable. Suddenly, after the plague, the math reversed entirely. Half the workforce was gone, buried in mass graves, making a living, breathing pair of hands incredibly precious. Landlords, who had once treated their serfs little better than livestock, found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to beg people to work their fields. Crops were rotting in the ground because there simply weren't enough bodies to harvest them, threatening the wealth of the entire landed aristocracy. It was the ultimate supply and demand shock. The supply of labor crashed, so the price of that labor inevitably skyrocketed across the board. The invisible chains that bound a serf to the land they were born on began to rust and break as opportunity beckoned from towns desperate for workers. This wasn't a violent revolution with pitchforks, but a quiet, inexorable economic shift that fundamentally altered the balance of power between rich and poor. The rigid structures that had defined people's lives for generations, you were born a peasant, you died a peasant, suddenly felt permeable and open to change. When the foundation of an entire economic system simply dies off, what new structures must necessarily rise to take its place? For the first time in memory, the common person, the one who actually built the world with sweat and muscle, realized they had leverage. Imagine the shock of a lord when a peasant, previously too terrified to make eye contact, suddenly demanded higher wages and better food for their labor. Governments tried to pass laws freezing wages at pre-plague levels, but these laws were largely ignored because the economic reality was too powerful to legislate away. To be fair, it wasn't an easy transition. There was immense pushback, leading to violent uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt in England a few decades later. But the genie was out of the bottle. Workers now moved around in search of the best offers, creating a nascent, mobile labor market. The standard of living for survivors actually improved significantly, with better diets and more disposable income available to the working class than ever before. You started to see the emergence of a middle class, people who weren't noble but were no longer desperately poor, bridging the gap between the extremes. It was a brutal shift, purchased with staggering amounts of death, but it laid the very groundwork for modern capitalism and labor relations. The idea that a person's worth was intrinsic to their labor, rather than their bloodline, was a radical, dangerous, and intoxicating new concept. Once a person tastes the dignity of being paid what they are truly worth, can they ever really be forced back into servitude? The most profound long-term effect of the Black Death was the shattering of unquestioned authority and the birth of a critical, skeptical mindset. Before the plague, the church held a monopoly on explaining the world. If something bad happened, it was God's will, and you didn't question it. But after watching the righteous die alongside the wicked, people began to ask dangerous questions that the old dogmas simply couldn't answer satisfyingly. Honesty required admitting that the ancient texts and the sermons from the pulpit had failed to predict, prevent, or explain the catastrophe. This doubt didn't lead to immediate atheism, but it cracked the foundation of blind faith, creating space for new ways of looking at the universe. People started looking less to the heavens for answers and more to the world around them, trusting their own eyes and experiences over ancient authority. You see the very early roots of the scientific method here, the idea that observation and evidence matter more than tradition and decrees. The intellectual grip of the medieval scholastic tradition was loosened, allowing for a more human-centered approach to philosophy and knowledge to emerge. It was a painful liberation, a tearing away from the comforting certainty of an ordered universe, replacing it with a chaotic but open-ended reality. When the old gods seem to die, do we stop believing entirely, or do we just start looking for better gods closer to home? It seems impossibly grim, but history shows us that periods of intense, mass death are often followed by explosions of extraordinary creativity and life. The survivors of the Black Death emerged with a profound, almost desperate realization of the brevity and preciousness of human existence. You know, the artistic theme of memento mori, remember you must die, became an obsession, but it evolved into a celebration of life itself. Wealth had been concentrated in fewer hands, and these new patrons, happy to be alive, spent lavishly on art, architecture, and beauty. The focus shifted from preparing for the afterlife to perfecting this life, sparking the intellectual and artistic movement we call the Renaissance. Artists began to paint the human body with realism and dignity, celebrating its form rather than seeing it merely as a vessel of sin. The revival of classical Greek and Roman texts, which emphasized human potential, found a fertile audience among people disillusioned with medieval limitations. Out of the unimaginable suffering of the plague years came a renewed belief in the power of the human mind to create and understand. It was as if humanity, having stared into the absolute abyss, decided to rebuild the world in a more beautiful, human-centric image. Is it necessary for humanity to be brought to the very brink of annihilation before we truly appreciate the potential of our own existence? As we look back at the Black Death from the comfort of our modern world, we shouldn't just see a history lesson, but a mirror. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium, but the real contagion, the one that truly reshaped society, was raw, unfiltered human fear. We like to think we have advanced tremendously since the 14th century, with our vaccines, global data networks, and scientific understanding. To be fair, our science has changed dramatically, but our fundamental emotional wiring, how we react to the unknown, hasn't changed a bit. When faced with a new crisis, we still see the same patterns: denial, panic, the search for scapegoats, and the spread of misinformation. The Black Death teaches us that a society's true strength isn't measured by its wealth or armies, but by its ability to care for its most vulnerable under pressure. It also proves the incredible resilience of our species, our ability to absorb unimaginable blows and not just survive, but eventually thrive and rebuild. The world we live in today, with its focus on the individual, its capitalist economy, its skepticism, is a direct, distant descendant of that plague-ridden world. The ghosts of the 14th century are still with us, whispering a warning that civilization is fragile and depends entirely on our cooperation. The question isn't if another great global challenge is coming, but whether next time we will let fear divide us or let our shared humanity unite us. Honestly, if this journey into the darker corners of history resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing that bell so you never miss a future episode. If you appreciate the effort put into crafting these deep dive documentaries, a simple like on the video really helps us out more than you know. And finally, think about sharing this story with someone else who loves history. You know, knowledge is the one thing that grows when you give it away.